There are many stories when weapons were adopted into service, to put it mildly, unfinished. Today's story starts with an anecdotal case. One of the traditions of the American Army for a long time was to send rifles freshly adopted by the troops to shooting competitions at Camp Perry. Accordingly, in 1939, a batch of M1 rifles went there as well. The Springfield factory had to urgently finish and rebuild the entire load of ammunition packs for this order. For one simple reason: although the rifle, which had been in service for 3 years, was supposed to work regardless of which side of the cartridge pack the top cartridge was on. In fact, if it was on the right side, the rifle was guaranteed to be delayed on the 7th cartridge. That is why it was necessary to modify all the rifles going to Camp Perry, so that the pack could be inserted only when the upper cartridge was on the left side, and the packs themselves were to be reassembled. However, this was just one of the episodes in the history of the rifle, which John Garand spent more than 15 years making. Garand was attracted to attention by his design for a handheld machine gun created for an army competition in 1917. Although the automatic rifle, by the then standard terminology, did not appear in metal until 1919 and was never further than an experimental model, it allowed Garand, who had only attended school until he was 11 years old, to get a position as an engineer at the Springfield Arsenal, where he eventually worked until his retirement. However, this design was still unpromising because it was based on capsule automatics invented in the 1880s, at that time still of interest to designers. But by the end of the 1930s, Roth's system could be safely buried because of the negligible impulse of automatics and accordingly incurable problems with reliability of operation. In addition, this weapon required a special cartridge with a non-standard design of the primer, which had an increased length and diameter. When fired, the primer was squeezed backwards, forcing backwards the striker, which had a very specific design. The striker and primer actually acted as a gas piston with a short stroke, but with fur inside. However, in 1920, with an obvious reference to Garand's experimental machine gun, his first semi-automatic rifle was released, still with the same primer motor and several feeding options, up to a 30-round magazine. In 1921, its bolt is redesigned. It is now locked by an oscillating wedge at the rear, rather than by 2 pivoting combat stops. It still uses a primer motor, but instead of a detachable magazine, it uses a detachable 5-round magazine. In 1923, the rifle was again finalized in a number of details and sent for the first Army trials, which it failed safely. The primer motor was extremely capricious and unreliable, which in general was quite expected. In 1926, Garand returned to the rotary bolt with front-locking lugs and abandoned the primer motor, but instead opted for another unsuccessful variant. The powder gases were discharged not from the barrel but from the blowback device, that is at the point of minimum pressure and minimum time of gas's impact on the piston. The bolt, as in the previous variants without gas engine, works directly inside the receiver like bolt-action rifles, but for its rotation and longitudinal movement, it uses a copy groove in the side link from the gas engine. In fact, the bolt pin of the Garand rifle is located at the place of bolt handle. It reminds one of British experiments with bolt-action rifles' conversion into semi-automatic rifles, where the bolt handle was cut off, but in a much more monstrous form. Well, the long-stroke gas engine with a return spring in the gas tube and the side-actuated rotary bolt drive itself clearly referred to the Mondragon rifle, but at that time it was not only patented in the US, but the patents were expired. This .3006 rifle was built in a single piece, as the Army was much more interested in the .276 caliber cartridge, which Remington Arms designer John Pedersen had developed for his competition rifle. In 1927, Garand was instructed to develop a new design for the Pedersen cartridge. At this time, the loading was already becoming canonical, using a double-row pack of 10 rounds, clearly referring to the same Mondragon rifle. However, 5 years later, the Army abandoned the .276 cartridge, leaving the good old .3006 in service, so these efforts were wasted. The experimental models of Garand rifles were put to a new round of tests in 1929. The Garand once again fails, and literally with a bang, the bolt breaks. And the formal winner, oddly enough, is the Czech Holek rifle. Further work is temporarily frozen as the Great Depression begins at the end of 1929, so the ideas of mass rearming the army with the new rifle have to wait. However, during this time, Garand managed to cure the main problems of the prototype, and the army officially refused to spend money on .276 cartridge when there was a huge amount of .3006 ammunition in stock. Accordingly, another prototype was developed for this cartridge, and after testing in 1935, it was adopted in 1936 under the designation U.S. Semi-Automatic Rifle Cal 30 M1. However, the rifle, which started to arrive in limited quantities to the Army, quickly demonstrated its inadequacy, which, to put it mildly, does not best characterize the conditions of competitive trials. This includes the failure after the sixth shot, mentioned in the introduction, when the ammunition pack, which had already become an 8-round rifle from a 10-shot rifle, was installed incorrectly, and insufficient reliability of the low-pulse gas engine in the first place, which forced to produce a modernized rifle by 1940, and to recall the already produced rifles to the factory for modification. In the new version, the Garand already uses a normal gas vent through a hole in the barrel, but again not far from the muzzle, which however still makes the impulse of the gas motor sufficient for adequate operation of the mechanism. However, the rifle still has its own diseases. For example, the famous pinching of the thumb by the bolt, as well as the tendency to spontaneous ejection of the stack before the cartridges were exhausted due to deformation of the transfer lever connected with the feeder, which bent the side locking device of the stack at the end of its lifting. In any case, the Second World War showed that the rifle was not perfect, but at that time it could be considered the best of the mass-produced rifles. Another thing is that in the theater of war, it was already understood that the future is for mass arming of soldiers with automatic weapons for reduced capacity cartridges, submachine guns, and automatic rifles for intermediate cartridge. And this, after a few years, completely turned the weapon thought on our side of the globe. And the Americans, as we remember in this respect, slowed down until Vietnam. Because by the beginning of the war, the main weapon of the Army and Marines was the M14 rifle and the M1 carbine, which appeared in the Army as a second-line weapon before the Second World War. Not only did not have an automatic mode of fire, but its cartridge was more of a pistol overgrowth than a full-fledged intermediate cartridge in terms of design and ballistics. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell so you don't miss new exciting videos. See you in the next video, where we will continue to reveal the secrets of the gun world. See you soon.